Kia ora everybody, welcome to week 3 of Human Anatomy and Physiology. This week we're going to look at tissues and the integumentary system. First part of today's lecture is on tissue, so just a quick reminder. Cells make up tissues which have a specific function. Those tissues then create our organs, organs create our organ systems, and then a collection of organ systems creates an organism. If you have the Essentials of Human Anatomy and Physiology textbook, then you'll find that under chapter 3, linked with cells and tissues. Any other anatomy textbook will have a section explaining tissues. So if we look at tissues, they're a group of similar cells. They act together to perform specific functions. These tissues then organize themselves into organs, as we know, and then organs are a group of 2 or more tissue types that act together to perform a specific common function. These tissue cells can be arranged in either really thin or single sheets of cells, right up to really thick walls containing millions of cells, or a combination of thin cells and thick cells. We can classify types of tissues into 4 different categories. So we have epithelial tissue, which are the tissues of the body that covers internal and external structures. We have muscle tissue, which we know about already. Muscle tissue allows movement, maintains posture, production of heat. We have nervous tissue, which is the tissue that creates or allows for electrical communication, sensory information, and coordinates a lot of our bodily functions. And then last one, which is probably our most diverse type of tissue type, is connective tissue, which in general forms the framework of the body, but connective tissue is much more complex than that. So let's start at the top. We'll look at epithelial tissue, think covers and lines. So with epithelial tissue, cells are either are closely packed into layers. So that a layer is called strata, similar to your atmosphere. If you remember school science, learning about the atmosphere is in different layers or strata. And there's little matrix. So the word matrix means the space in between the cells and what that space is made up of. So epithelial tissue is closely packed layers of cells with not a lot of space in between those cells. They can be either single layered or multi-layer, and generally those multi-layers will sit on top of a type of connective tissue. These are relatively basic cells capable of rapid replication, so mitosis or cell splitting and growing. Nerves can pass between sheets of cells, however blood vessels do not. So epithelial tissue is generally avascular. Avascular meaning doesn't have access to blood vessels, meaning no access to nutrients. Nutrients and gases can move from connective tissue below and move up towards the surface of epithelial tissue. This means that the layers closer to connective tissue are more well supplied with oxygen and nutrients. Upper layers not so much. And this will be a little bit clearer when we look at the layers of the skin and the function of the top layer of skin. We can also define epithelial tissue based on its structure in terms of how many layers it's made up of and the shapes of the cells that make up epithelial tissue. So 2 things to I guess understand is we have simple epithelium, which just means one layer of cells. One layer means that this type of tissue is really good for absorption, so absorbing substances, secretion, so pushing substances out of those single layers, or filtration, so it can act like almost like a sieve to filter and stop things that shouldn't be getting through and allowing things that should be getting through. Then stratified epithelium is multi-layered. So stratified just means you've got multi-layers of strata, any more than 2 or more layers. These cells regenerate from below, so from the deepest layers, and they are replaced by newer cells underneath, and those newer cells move towards the top. The older they get, new cells are replaced from the bottom. So there's a cycle of replication from deep, closer to the connective tissue where there is a supply of oxygen and nutrients. And this type of system is really good for protection because you've got this constant replication and changing of old cells with new cells. So really good for protection. So if you think about skin, that's how our epidermis works, is replacing old cells with new cells from the bottom up. Now we can also describe the cells of epithelial tissue based on their shapes. Similar to the skeletal system and classifying bones and shapes, these ones are quite simple. Squamous, think squashed, so they're flat, think like a pancake. Squamous, flat. Cuboidal, square or cube-shaped cells, and then columnar are really, really long. So if you think about, based on that understanding, if I said, can you draw an example of stratified cuboidal epithelial tissue, all you got to do is break down stratified, means more than one layer, so you'd have to draw more than one layer, and that the cells that you draw would be shaped like a cube. The little circles inside these cells represent the nucleus. Now you can also classify epithelial tissue based on where it occurs in the body. So epithelium tissue lines any surface exposed to the outside environment. That can be a little bit tricky to understand because we assume straight away that that means like our skin, but it also means surfaces that are exposed to the food we eat and the surfaces that are exposed to the gas we inhale. So the surfaces in our mouth and our trachea, all through our digestive system, even though it's internal, those epithelium tissues are exposed to the outside environment. Endothelium covers internal surfaces. So if we think about the heart, and inside the hollow chambers of the heart, there's some linings. That's an example of endothelium. Still structured the same as any kind of epithelial tissue. It's just that term explains that it's internal. Glandular epithelium is specific to the epithelial tissue that makes up our endocrine and exocrine glands, and they contain secretory cells. So generally the columnar stuff that's really long is shaped like that because it has the ability to produce and secrete hormones. Muscle cells we're pretty familiar with now. As of last week we covered these. The same picture was in last week's PowerPoint, but we have smooth muscle, which is involuntary, and it moves digestive material through our system. I mentioned last week that if you were standing on your head, you could eat lunch, and that food would still move against gravity because of the smooth muscle inside your hollow digestive organs. Similarly, the hollow blood vessels in your cardiovascular system have a layer of smooth muscle to allow those vessels to constrict or dilate. Cardiac muscle found in your heart, also under involuntary control, and then we got skeletal muscle. If you watched the video on this week's self-directed task, you'll see that each cell of either smooth cardiac or skeletal muscle is very different based on striations and shape and how many nuclei each one of those have. So that's a good video to watch to check out a little bit more about muscular tissue. And then we have nervous tissue, which is, so this is an example of a cell that is a part of the nervous system or nervous tissue. You'll see that it doesn't look like any of the diagrams we've seen before, but the head of this axon has the nucleus in the middle. It also has some mitochondria in there. So even though it might not look like our typical cell, cells aren't a typical shape. So this is an example of a cell in the nervous system. Its main component in making up our brain, our spinal cord, and our nerves. We have pretty much two cells in our nervous system: neurons, which is all that yellow shape with the spiky ends and the little fingertails. They are the main structural cell or unit, highly specialized. They conduct messages from nerve impulses from one part of the body to another. And the neuroglial cells, or neuroglia, are our supporting cells. So they act like insulation. They are the little blue, they almost look like bubbles around the tail of this neuron. If you think about an electrical wire, you have the copper on the inside, that's like your neuron, and then the outside is the plastic or the rubber, and that's like your neuroglial cells. So the rubber helps keep messages traveling the way they're supposed to. If you have damage to that neuroglial space, or the rubber of your electrical wiring is damaged, it means that things can short circuit or messages can be lost. So I believe like Alzheimer's disease is a disease where those neuroglial cells are damaged, so it means that the message is getting interrupted. I'll have to double check that it is Alzheimer's, but some of those degenerative nervous system diseases, some of them will be underlined by damage to the neuroglial cells and messages being interrupted. Okay, and then our most diverse is the connective tissue, which is our body's framework. Whereas all our other tissues are mostly comprised of cells, connective tissue is largely made up of a non-living substance called your extracellular matrix. This matrix separates and surrounds the cells that are in connective tissue, and they have three main elements, and I think of it as like jelly. So we've got the ground substance, which if you think about making jelly, you need water. You've got fibers in connective tissue. If we relate that to our jelly analogy, that's like the gelatin that gives that water some structure, and the more gelatin you have, the sort of more solid it will be. The less gelatin you have, the more liquidy it will be. So fibers are similar. You got more fibers, the more solid it will be, a bit like bone. The less solid it will be, the more liquidy that matrix is, like blood. Both are examples of connective tissue. And then you've got, in this example, jelly with fruit in it. And these pieces of fruit just represent cells in connective tissue. And you'll see that they're suspended within this extracellular matrix and not completely packed tightly. Connective tissue is found everywhere in the body, and it's the most abundant and widely distributed of all four tissues. And that's because it helps bind and keep everything together. So here are some examples of connective tissue. So we have bone. So bone cells are sitting in a very hard calcium matrix. So our skeleton is an example of a lot of bone tissue, a lot of connective tissue. Cartilage, less hard, it's a bit more flexible, rubbery matrix. So if you think about hyaline cartilage in forming bone or in the articular spaces of joints, your nose and in your ear is an example of cartilage. Then we have dense connective tissue. These fibers within the ground substance create this strong rope-like matrix. So things like our tendons and our ligaments, a super strong kind of structure. And then we have loose connective tissue, which is a bit more of a cobwebby structure, cushions and protects body organs, helps suspend organs in place, holds organs where they need to be, but fat is also an example of loose connective tissue. And then we have blood, which is like the opposite of bone in terms of structure. It's a liquidy connective tissue. Its extracellular matrix is fluid or plasma, and then it surrounds all of the cells within your blood. So your blood cells, your red and white blood cells. So that plasma is non-living, whereas your blood cells within that matrix are living. So you can see that all connective tissue examples have those three things: ground substance, fibers, and cells. It just depends on the makeup of those three things as to if it's going to be a really hard matrix or if it's going to be a completely fluid matrix, like bone or like blood, or somewhere in between. Here's some examples of all of those tissues in the body. So top left, we got epithelial tissue, line surfaces in the body. So that's showing skin, which we'll look at today. Muscle tissue, that's an example of skeletal muscle, bicep. On the far right top corner, we got neurons. So you can see all the stuff in blue, that's our nervous system, which is the pathway where messages go from either our spinal cord or our brain. Down the bottom is our four different types of connective tissue found within the body. So we got the loose connective tissue, bone and cartilage. They've linked into one, so that's our dense connective tissue, and bone is a separate, and then blood. So this would be good to know in terms of, can I name type of tissue and give an example of where it might be found in the body. Okay, part B, which is a little bit more specific to skin and a lot of the epithelial structure of tissue. So here's our example of our integumentary system, which is mostly skin, but not only. But the integument includes body membranes, skin, hair, fingernails, and all of the glands which we find within skin. The skin is multiple layered, protects the body, helps to regulate body temperature, and helps to excrete waste via sweat. Regulating temperature is huge, and it's actually the long answer question for this week. The skin is the first barrier to keeping good things such as water in, but also keeping bad things such as harmful bacteria out. So a big function in protection and immunity. We can summarize those functions into sensation, so sensing the world and our environment, protection and immunity, absorption and excretion, vitamin D synthesis, and temperature regulation. The integumentary system includes our skin, the glands within the skin, your hair and your nails. It's the largest organ and it's the heaviest organ, making up roughly 70% of your body's weight. So if you take your body weight, multiply it by 7% or 0.07, that will give you your weight in kilograms, your skin's weight in kilograms. So it's going to go through some anatomy. You will need to be able to label this cube sample of skin. So in the tutorial, most of it is going to be around identifying functions and physiology, but also can you label this cube? So be familiar with this. Skin is comprised primarily of two regions. If you think about a cube of licorice and the black licorice that you can peel off, that top layer is all wobbly. That's your epidermis. And then underneath the epidermis you have your dermis, and then underneath the dermis is the hypodermis or subcutaneous layer. Cutaneous, the word cutaneous refers to anything to do with skin, sub meaning underneath. It's not actually considered a layer of the skin, but it is the third layer of skin. So epidermis and dermis are our two layers of skin, and then our hypodermis is a type of connective tissue which sits underneath and actually feeds nutrients up through. Epidermis, top layer, made up of cells called keratinocytes and release a chemical called keratin. Your epidermis contains 4 to 5 layers. These provide barriers against the outside world. Keratinocytes release a protein called keratin that causes toughening on skin. So if you think about it, anytime you have a callus form, it's just from repetition of friction where keratinocytes release keratin and that space hardens, meaning that you don't have damage to that skin long term if it's an area that receives friction all the time. So all of you gym buffs probably have calluses on your hands from gripping bars. It's avascular, so it means no blood supply, but there is pores or like tunnels to the surface. Its skin color can range from almost black to nearly colorless. This is determined primarily by the pigment in our skin called melanin. I think melanin sounds like skin, melanin skin, which is produced by melanocytes. Remember, cytes means a cell, so a melanocyte is a cell that produces the pigment melanin. More melanin, the darker the skin tone. So when you're out in the sun, that triggers melanocytes to produce melanin so that your skin gets darker and protects you against UV exposure. Freckles, moles, age spots all occur where melanin is concentrated in one area. Activity of a healthy dermis. So this is something I was talking about before with epithelial tissue that migrates from younger cells underneath to older cells on top. So first step is we have cellular replication, where the cells from below split and replicate, and replacing the new ones are replaced underneath, and older ones move. So second stage is migration, and migration is when these older cells are pushed towards the surface, or more superficial. And then desquamation is a fancy name for skin cells that are most superficial flaking off when they become in contact with the external environment. Next we have our dermis, which is the big layer underneath the epidermis. Second layer of skin contains blood vessels, so it's vascular. We also have sweat glands, oil glands, contains our cutaneous receptors for sensing the world. And this is a space where we can help to regulate temperature or site of thermoregulation. So this is where all the action happens in terms of getting rid of heat or holding on to heat. You will need to be able to label the different glands of the skin. So we have our sebaceous or oil glands. They secrete this oily matter called sebum. They secrete that into the space of the hair follicle to lubricate skin and hair. Sebum is mildly antibacterial, so it provides a surface that can be detrimental to bacteria. So it's part of the immune function of protecting us against foreign invaders or baddies. Sweat glands, pseudoiferous. I remember this term as pseudo, sounds like sumo. Because sumo wrestlers are massive, I think of them as being very sweaty. So pseudoiferous glands are our sweat glands. And you'll see that they are in the dermis, isolated by themselves, and they feed up into a pore, which releases out into the world. We have roughly 2 million sweat glands, and sweat then evaporates on hot skin, and that's how we remove heat through convection. Sweat also contains water, so if we have it's a way to remove water to help us cool down. There's also some metabolic acids and salts that we lose. So that's why it's important to be replacing water, but also replacing salts, which are also the same as electrolytes. We can eliminate waste through these pores as well. So this is a strategy for getting rid of wastes. Cutaneous receptors. Touch, so being able to touch the world, touch surfaces, know if something's hot, know if something's sharp, is because of the receptors that we have in our skin. We've got receptors that can detect like touch, pressure and vibrations, pain and temperature, and within these different types of receptors there are even subcategories for some of these. We don't need to know that. Really, just the take-home message is that we have sensory receptors or cutaneous receptors in our dermis that detect the world. This diagram shows these like onion-looking sensors. They don't always look like that. Just as an example, those are sensory cutaneous receptors in our skin. Hair is also a part of our integumentary system. So we have the hair shaft, which is exposed to the outside world, and the hair follicle is like where the root is embedded. You'll see that there's some blood vessels that feed into it. Cutaneous receptors are also hooked up to it. So, you know, if something brushes past your hair on your arm, you will detect that. Hair acts as a protection function through shielding. So we've got hair in our eyes, so we can shut our eyes and blink and keep stuff out of our eyes. There's a little muscle attached to all of the hairs on our body called the erectopili muscle. When these contract, that puts your hair up on end, creating goosebumps. From what I understand is, when you have goosebumps, what happens is your skin actually, the surface area decreases or tightens up, and that's another strategy for holding in heat, just like wearing compressive thermals. Hypodermis, so that's our connective tissue at the bottom. It's not considered a part of the skin. It's essentially fat or adipose tissue. It helps anchor our skin onto our body. So if we lift our skin up, it's the connective tissue underneath that helps keep that where it's supposed to be. It acts like a shock absorber, insulation for internal organs, and is an area where nutrients can be fed up through those blood vessels in the dermis. Nails, real simple. We don't need to know a lot about this other than they protect the ends of our fingers. Historically used as a tool, which we still use for like scratching, but also digging, those kinds of things. If we didn't have nails on the end of our fingers, much more prone to injury of that space. Here in the tutorial we'll use these slides just to be able to make sure we know how to label these pieces of the skin. Epidermis, dermis, hypodermis. Hair shaft, follicle, just so knowing that the hair shaft is outside of the skin, follicle is underneath. Be able to label a pore, our sebaceous or oil glands, cutaneous receptors, pseudoiferous or sweat glands. I'd be happy to accept oil gland, sweat gland, but if you can nail the technical anatomical term, would be even better. Rectopili muscle. Here's a bit more detail around the cutaneous receptors within our skin. I'm just going to touch on a bit of physiology. So protection and immunity. Our skin prevents entry of foreign substances as a barrier. We also have secretion, so our sebum, and the melanin within our melanocytes protects us against the UV. Adipose tissue provides protection of underlying structures, so that's how we protect and are immune to the functions of the skin. Absorption, so topically, meaning applied to the top of your skin. Products such as drugs, chemicals, some skincare products have the ability to be absorbed into the skin, especially if they are lipid soluble. So if they are able to be absorbed because they are fat soluble, then our skin is able to absorb. Skin secretes waste via our sweat glands. We also secrete water salts, urea, uric acid, ammonia can be eliminated in our body this way, small amounts of those things. And then body secretes sebum that protects the skin surface from invaders. So that's the excretion stuff. Excretion means to excrete waste. Secretion is actually secreting something that you need or is useful. So there is a difference between excretion and secretion. Both are taking substances out. On exposure to UV light, there's a substance within our skin that helps convert UV light into vitamin D, and this happens in the liver and kidneys. Vitamin D is required for the absorption of calcium and phosphorus, so it's really important. You don't need to know what that substance is. I googled it and it's like a pretty technical term, so just know that there is a substance within the skin that helps convert UV light into vitamin D, and that we need vitamin D as part of the process of absorbing calcium and phosphorus. Now, thermoregulation is really important. This is showing the top layer of epidermis. And these are blood vessels, so there's blood in these tunnels, you could say. And we'll know a bit more about this when we do cardiovascular system. But if they dilate or get bigger in the skin, then blood can get there. Blood has heat in it, especially if you've been exercising or moving, and it allows the sweat that's on skin to take away that heat through either radiation and through convection, or those blood vessels can constrict and become smaller and limit blood flow to the skin and make it deeper so that that heat in the blood is retained. So if you go for a run, face especially, it'll be all pink and hot. That's because the vessels in your skin have gotten bigger. Blood is being rushed to your skin. Internal vessels will be constricted to keep blood flow towards the skin. And the flip for getting rid of heat. The flip will happen if you're trying to hold on to heat. Vessels in your skin will constrict, vessels deep will dilate, keeping temperature internal or deeper so that you don't lose heat. This is something that we'll talk about in a bit more detail in the tutorials, but you'll recognize the seesaw. Yeah? So there's a stimulus that happens, your control center receives messages, and that is your thermostat. It sends out messages to the effectors, which various things will happen, and this will help decrease that original stimulus. So that's if you're too hot, here if you're too cold, and we'll go through this in a bit more detail in the tutorials. Okay, crew, again, don't panic. Check out those Quizlet resources. Online quiz, don't forget, opens on Friday, closes the following week, and I'll see you all in the lecture this week.